The rejection ceremony was supposed to break her. The great hall of the Silver Keep was built to humble the weak. It was a cavernous, oppressive expanse of black stone and wrought iron, lit by hundreds of torches that cast long, Gothic shadows across the vaulted ceiling. The air was thick with the scent of burning pine, roasted meat, and the suffocating, aggressive pheromones of a hostile pack. Hundreds of wolves stood shoulder to shoulder in the viewing galleries, their eyes gleaming in the flickering light, waiting for a spectacle. They wanted a tragedy. They expected tears, begging the pitiful collapse of a woman who had dared to dream above her station. Saren Frostmore stood at the base of the sovereign's dais, completely still. She was dressed in a plain, unadorned gown of grey wool, her hands folded quietly at her waist. Her knuckles were white from the force of her grip, but her posture was flawless. Her spine was perfectly straight, her chin tipped upward, just enough to maintain her dignity without crossing into open defiance. Inside her chest, her inner wolf paced in the shadows, confused and agitated by the overwhelming hostility, but Saren did not let a single tremor show on her face. She kept her storm-glass eyes locked on the stone steps ahead of her, cataloguing the spidery patterns of ice creeping up the iron braziers. She had spent 3 years preparing for this exact day. 3 years of enduring the harsh, militant customs of the northern stronghold, learning the sprawling lineages of the northern lords, and swallowing the cruel jests of the inner circle. All of it had been for the fated mate bond, the sacred thread that was supposed to bind her to the reigning sovereign and elevate her to the highest seat of power. Instead, it had become a noose. Above her stood Jackson Silverbane. The Alpha King wore the heavy, fur-lined mantle of his absolute authority, an iron crown resting upon his dark hair. His presence was physically heavy, radiating a metallic tang of ozone and dominance that made the younger wolves in the room bare their throats in instinctual submission. He stared down at the woman he had been fated to protect, his jaw set in a hard, arrogant line. There was no warmth in his gaze. There was no hesitation. He viewed her not as a mate, but as a miscalculation, a stain on his pristine court. Beside him stood Evelyn Voss. Saren did not blink as she observed her sister. Evelyn was beautiful in the way a winter frost was beautiful, sharp, glittering, and entirely cold. She wore the ceremonial lunar silk, a heavy, breathtaking garment dyed in deep violet and threaded with spun silver. It was the exact dress Saren had spent 6 months weaving by hand in the dim light of her chambers, anticipating the day she would finally be presented to the kingdom as their true queen. Every stitch had been a prayer, every silver thread a vow of loyalty. Now, the silk draped perfectly over Evelyn's shoulders, the mistress standing exactly where the fated mate belonged. A cloying scent of poisoned honey and expensive perfume drifted down from the dais, masking the underlying rot of the betrayal. Jackson raised a hand. The sprawling hall fell into a deathly, immediate silence. The only sound was the crackle of the torches and the howling of the winter wind rattling the high glass windows. He descended the first 2 steps of the dais, his heavy boots echoing like hammer strikes against an anvil. When he reached Saren, he did not offer her a hand of comfort. He extended his arm and roughly seized the collar of her grey dress. With a sharp, violent tug, he pulled the fabric down over her left shoulder, exposing her bare skin to the freezing air and the hundreds of staring eyes. There, resting over her collarbone, was her mating mark. It was not the deep, vibrant black of a fully realized bond. It was pale, faded, a faint jagged scar that resembled a bruise more than a divine decree. "Witness this," Jackson commanded, his voice booming off the stone walls, vibrating in Saren's very bones. "See the weakness the ancestors supposedly chose for me, a defective mark for a barren, hollow woman. For 3 years I have waited for this bond to awaken. For 3 years I have harbored a Luna who cannot command, who cannot shift, and who cannot carry the future of this fortress. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone in the back snickered. The sound cut through the heavy air like a rusted blade. Jackson released her collar, letting the rough wool snap back against her chilled skin. He turned his back on her, walking back up the steps to take Evelyn's hand. The mistress smiled, a small, triumphant curving of her red lips as she intertwined her fingers with the Alpha King's. "This territory requires strength," Jackson continued, his voice echoing with absolute, unquestionable authority. "It requires a Luna whose blood runs hot, whose wolf commands respect, and whose presence demands obedience. Evelyn Voss possesses the strength that her sister lacks. Therefore, by the ancient right of the Alpha Decree, I sever this stagnant tether." The physical agony hit Saren before he even finished the sentence. It was not a metaphorical pain. It was a vicious, biological tearing. The faint mark on her collarbone suddenly burned, as if someone had pressed a white-hot branding iron directly against her flesh. Saren's breath hitched, trapping itself in her throat. The sacred thread woven between their souls, a dormant, fragile thing, but deeply rooted nonetheless, began to stretch. It pulled taut, vibrating with excruciating tension, and then it snapped. The recoil was devastating. Saren felt the phantom blood rush to her ears. The temperature of her own skin plummeted, the warmth draining from her extremities in a matter of seconds. Her inner wolf released a silent, agonizing howl, collapsing onto its side in the dark void of her mind. The pain radiated down her arms, making her fingertips go entirely numb. It felt as though a blunt, rusted knife was twisting between her ribs, carving away a fundamental piece of her anatomy and leaving a freezing, empty cavern in its wake. She tasted copper on her tongue. The sheer biological trauma of a broken bond was enough to kill a weaker wolf, but Saren forced herself to keep breathing. Inhale the ice. Exhale the weakness. Jackson stared down at her, waiting. He wanted the collapse. He needed her to shatter. He needed the validation of her tears, to prove to his pack that he was making the right choice, that he was discarding a pathetic, weak creature who could not survive without him. Evelyn watched with wide, glittering eyes, eager to drink in her sister's utter humiliation. The entire court held its breath, waiting for the outcast to fall to her knees and beg for a scrap of mercy. Saren did not move. She catalogued the physical sensations, the burning skin, the freezing blood, the agonizing void. She took all of it, gathered it into a tight, hardened sphere within her chest, and locked it away. She slowly pulled the frayed collar of her dress back up, covering the raw, blistering skin where the mark had been broken. She lifted her chin. Her striking eyes met Jackson's cold, arrogant stare. There were no tears pooling in her lashes. There was no tremor in her pale lips. There was only a vast, terrifying emptiness that seemed to unnerve the Alpha King for a fraction of a second. "I accept," Saren said. 2 words, spoken quietly, but the acoustics of the silent hall carried them perfectly to every listening ear. There was no waver in her tone, no plea, no anger, just an absolute, bone-chilling calm. Jackson's jaw tightened. A flash of genuine irritation cracked his stoic facade. This was not the reaction he had orchestrated. "You are hereby stripped of your rank, your titles, and your quarters in the upper keep," he gritted out, his voice lowering into a dangerous, rumbling growl. "You will be relegated to the outer gardens. You will labor as a common servant. You will not speak to the inner pack, and you will turn away from your new Luna rather than meeting her gaze." Saren held his stare for one more heartbeat. She did not lower her head. Without another word, she turned on her heel. The heavy wooden doors at the end of the hall seemed miles away, but she walked toward them with an unbent spine. The crowd parted instinctively, stepping back from the woman they had just mocked, as if her sudden, cold dignity were a physical force pushing them away. She departed the great hall, leaving the warmth, the betrayal, and the heavy iron crown behind her. She stepped into the freezing night. Saren was very good at being unseen. Now she would simply disappear into the dirt. The desolate palace gardens were where you went to be forgotten. It was day 10 of her exile. The brutal northern wind howled down from the jagged peaks of the mountains, sweeping across the exposed terraces of the icy citadel. The sky was the color of bruised iron, heavy with the promise of a coming blizzard. Saren knelt on the frozen earth. Her knees were buried in the hardened mud, the coarse fabric of her servant's dress offering zero protection against the biting chill. The ground here was unforgiving. It was a desolate patch of land, far from the golden warmth of the inner courtyard, a place where the shadows of the high stone walls obscured the afternoon sun. She held a rusted iron trowel in her right hand. She brought it down against the soil. The impact sent a painful, jarring shock up her wrist, but she merely adjusted her grip and struck the earth again. The dirt was frozen solid, bound together by thick, spidery veins of white ice. Her hands were bare. The skin across her knuckles had cracked in the dry, freezing air, bleeding sluggishly. The crimson drops smeared across the wooden handle of the trowel, drying almost instantly in the bitter cold. Her lips were a pale, chapped blue, and her dark hair was whipped into a tangled frenzy by the relentless wind. She preferred this. The quiet isolation of the dead garden was a sanctuary compared to the suffocating political theatre of the keep. Here in the exile, there were no judgmental whispers. There were no pitying glances from the kitchen staff, and there was no suffocating scent of Evelyn's poisoned honey perfume. Beyond the walls, there was only the wind, the ice, and the honest, brutal reality of survival. The cold did not lie. It bit, it numbed, and it reduced things to their absolute core. Saren understood the cold. She dug her bruised fingers into the cracked earth, pulling away a cluster of dead, blackened roots. Her task was to clear the northern terrace of the withered flora, a grueling menial labor designed specifically by Jackson to break her spirit. It was a punishment meant to humiliate the former bride, forcing her to kneel in the dirt while the rest of the pack prepared for the upcoming winter solstice banquets. The physical toll was immense, but it was nothing compared to the silence of her inner wolf. Ever since the bond was severed, her wolf had remained curled in the darkest corner of her mind, shivering and utterly silent. The biological shock had left Saren in a state of profound physical exhaustion. Her joints ached constantly. Her core temperature refused to stabilize, leaving her perpetually shivering beneath her thin wool cloak. The brand on her collarbone had stopped burning, but it had left a raised, jagged scar that throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache every time her heart beat. She did not let herself stop working. Pausing meant thinking, and thinking meant allowing the overwhelming tide of betrayal to breach her mental walls. Saren struck the frozen earth again. The edge of the rusted trowel slipped on a jagged piece of buried shale. The sharp rock sliced deep into the palm of her hand. She gasped, a short, sharp intake of freezing air as fresh, warm blood welled up from the cut. It was a deep laceration, trailing thick crimson down her wrist and dripping rapidly into the frozen mud. She dropped the trowel, gritting her teeth against the sting. As she reached to press her sleeve against the wound, her gaze fell into the small crater she had just excavated. The trowel had chipped away a chunk of ice, revealing the dormant bulbs of a dying frost blossom beneath the surface. She paused, her breath plumbing in a thick white cloud before her face. She stared down at the small, pathetic plant. Its leaves were curled inward, blackened by the frost, desperately trying to preserve whatever fragile life remained within its core. It was starving for warmth. It was buried under layers of hostile, freezing dirt, entirely forgotten by the gardeners, who tended only to the vibrant, showy flowers of the inner courtyard. It was a sacred plant, a relic of the ancient winter gods, left to rot in the mud. With agonizing slowness, Saren extended her hand. She did not bother to bandage her palm. She simply let her bloody, Dirt-stained fingers brush against the withered petals. A single, heavy drop of her blood fell from her cut, landing perfectly in the center of the blackened bloom. Far in the distance, high up in the monolithic stone towers of the keep, a set of massive golden windows glowed brightly against the darkening sky. That was the Alpha's wing. The grand chambers where Jackson and Evelyn were undoubtedly draped in furs, sitting before a roaring hearth, drinking spiced wine and laughing with their elite court. The warmth of that room was a completely different world. It was a world Saren had been promised, a world she had quietly prepared for, and a world that had been violently stolen from her in a matter of minutes. She turned away from the glowing windows and focused back on the freezing dirt. Let them have the fire. Let them have the heavy crowns and the poisoned politics. Saren wiped a streak of frozen mud from her cheek with the back of her clean hand, her pale irises narrowing against the biting wind. She took a deep, rattling breath of the pine-scented air. Her lungs burned with the chill, but it grounded her. She was alive. She was breathing. The bond was gone. The status was gone, but her mind was her own. She had walked away from that hall without giving them a single tear, and she would dig through this frozen wasteland without uttering a single complaint. Then, the dirt began to hum. It was a low, resonant vibration, starting deep within the frozen soil beneath her knees. Saren froze, her hand still hovering over the dying frost blossom. The blackened petals where her blood had fallen began to shift. The crimson stain did not freeze. Instead, it dissolved into the plant, absorbed like water into dry earth. Before her eyes, the shriveled, frost-bitten leaves uncurled. The dark rot vanished, replaced by a brilliant, luminescent silver. In the span of a single heartbeat, the frost blossom bloomed perfectly, radiating a pure, icy light that pushed back the shadows of the garden. The temperature around Saren dropped, but it was no longer the biting, hostile chill of the northern wind. It was a pristine, ancient cold, the kind of cold that preserved. A fragile, glowing shape detached itself from the silver petals. It fluttered upward, leaving a trail of shimmering frost dust in the air. Saren watched, her breath catching, as a butterfly made entirely of crystalline ice and ethereal light hovered before her face. Then another rose from the soil, and another. Within seconds, the garden was alive with them. Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of glowing frost butterflies emerged from the frozen earth, awakened by the blood of a lineage older than the keep itself. They swarmed into the air, a breathtaking cyclone of silver light, before slowly descending to circle around Saren. They wove themselves into a luminous, sacred halo, hovering just above her dark hair. The mythical crown of winter, her inner wolf, dormant and broken for 10 days, suddenly opened its eyes in the dark, releasing a low, resonant rumble of absolute power. The viper root poison that Evelyn had secretly fed her for years could no longer hold back the ancient magic of the frost gods. At that exact moment, the massive iron gates of the expansive courtyard groaned open. A deafening horn blast shattered the quiet of the afternoon. The heavy tramp of armored boots and the grinding of carriage wheels echoed across the cobblestones. Jackson Silverbane and his elite guard rushed forth from the keep, their cloaks snapping in the wind, desperately trying to assemble a formal, welcoming line. The Moonlit Wolf King had arrived to sign the boundary treaty. Silas Mooncrest rode at the head of a terrifying column of dark-furred wolves and armored riders. The legendary sovereign of the Moonlit territory possessed a physical presence that dwarfed Jackson entirely. Silas wore no heavy furs, only armor of forged midnight steel and a cloak as dark as a starless sky. His storm-grey eyes swept the courtyard, radiating an immense, suffocating authority that instantly forced Jackson's guard to drop their gazes. The scent of pine, starlight, and ozone rolled off him in waves, the primal aura of an apex predator who had never known defeat. Jackson stepped forward, smoothing his arrogant posture, preparing to deliver a speech of brotherhood and territorial negotiation. He expected Silas to halt his destrier, to dismount and acknowledge the alpha of the ruling pack. Silas did not even glance at Jackson. His gaze had snapped past the alpha, past the armored guards, and locked directly onto the desolate frozen garden. He saw the servant girl kneeling in the mud in a torn grey dress. He saw the bleeding hands, and he saw the 10,000 frost butterflies swarming above her head, the undeniable sacred halo of frost. Silas pulled hard on his reins, halting his massive mount so abruptly that the beast reared, its hooves striking sparks against the stone. The entire column of the moonlit court stopped in perfect, terrifying unison. Jackson faltered. "King Silas, we welcome you to the Silver." Silas vaulted from his saddle. He did not speak. He did not acknowledge the Alpha King standing just 10 feet away. He strode forward with long, predatory steps, his dark cloak billowing behind him. He walked straight past Jackson, brushing past the bewildered guards, his eyes fixed entirely on Saren. The air in the courtyard grew dangerously thin. Jackson turned, his face flushing with insulted fury, but he froze when Silas crossed the threshold of the dead garden. The frost butterflies parted instinctively, creating a shimmering path for the moonlit king. Saren remained kneeling in the mud, her grey eyes wide as the towering, terrifying sovereign approached her. She expected violence. She expected a reprimand for being in his path. Instead, Silas Mooncrest, the most feared warlord in the northern realms, stopped before her. He observed her bleeding hands, the ragged wool of her dress, and the glowing crown of magic above her head. His dark gaze softened with a reverence that defied every rumor of his cruelty. Without a single word, Silas dropped to his knees in the freezing mud. He bowed his head, submitting his absolute terrifying authority to the quiet woman with the unbent spine. The entire court went deadly silent, and for the first time in her life, Saren was truly seen. The silence in the courtyard was not merely the absence of sound. It was a physical weight. Saren remained utterly still, her bruised knees buried in the frozen mud of the northern terrace, staring at the towering figure bowed before her. Silas Mooncrest, the legendary sovereign of the moonlit territory, knelt in the dirt. His dark armor, forged from midnight steel and etched with ancient celestial runes, absorbed the dim light of the bruised sky. The heavy, fur-lined edge of his cloak pooled around his armored greaves, soaking up the freezing slush, but he did not seem to care. His massive shoulders were perfectly still, his head bowed in a posture of absolute submission. Above them, the luminous vortex pulsed in the biting wind. 10,000 delicate frost butterflies, summoned from the awakened frost blossom, swirled in a slow, luminous vortex. Their wings emitted a soft, crystalline chiming, the only sound daring to break the suffocating quiet of the tense courtyard. Saren catalogued the impossible reality of the moment. Her breath plumed in pale clouds. Her hands, still stained with her own blood, and the black dirt of her exile, trembled marginally, but she forced her spine to remain rigid. She was a woman who had been stripped of her fated bond, her titles, and her dignity. Yet the most feared warlord in the realm was treating her as if she were a deity. Silas slowly lifted his head. His piercing gaze met her icy stare. There was no pity in his expression. Pity was an emotion for the weak. Instead, she found a profound, anchoring reverence. The ambient temperature around them shifted. The hostile, biting chill of the territory faded, replaced by the crisp, ancient cold of a deep winter forest. A cold that did not sting but preserved. The scent of pine, wood smoke, and starlight rolled off him, sweeping over her senses and pushing back the suffocating metallic tang of the keep. Inside her chest, the void left by her severed mate bond ached dully. For 10 days, her inner wolf had lain curled in the darkest corner of her mind, broken and silent. Now, under the steady protective weight of the warlord's gaze, her wolf stirred. It did not cower. It rose slowly to its paws, lifting its muzzle to the metaphorical sky, and released a soft, questioning rumble. It was not a claim. It was an acknowledgement of an equal. "You bleed," Silas murmured. His voice was a low, tectonic rumble that vibrated through the frozen earth and settled deep in her marrow. He did not ask for permission to enter her space. He simply moved with a deliberate, agonizingly slow caution, telegraphing his every intention so as not to startle her. He raised one massive, gauntleted hand. The midnight steel of his armor was freezing, but as he carefully peeled off the heavy metal glove, his bare skin was surprisingly warm. He reached out and gently cradled her wounded right hand. Saren tensed instinctively, her muscles locking as she prepared for the inevitable cruelty she had come to expect from powerful men. But Silas only held her fingers, his thumb hovering just above the deep laceration she had suffered from the rusted trowel. A kingdom that demands the blood of its true queen for its dirt is a kingdom that deserves to rot, he said, the words quiet but laced with a terrifying, absolute conviction. As he spoke, one of the luminous frost butterflies fluttered down from the halo above her head. It landed delicately on the edge of her wound. The searing sting of the cut vanished instantly. A thin, beautiful layer of crystalline ice sealed the torn flesh, stopping the bleeding and numbing the pain. Silas did not flinch as the ancient magic brushed against his skin. He watched the process with solemn respect. "I am no queen," Saren replied, her voice slightly raspy from days of silence. She kept her tone perfectly neutral, refusing to let the shock waver her composure. She did not pull her hand away. "I am a servant, relegated to the dirt." Silas's jaw tightened, a muscle feathered in his cheek, the only outward sign of the monstrous fury boiling beneath his calm facade. "You are Saren Frostmoor. The blood of the winter gods runs in your veins. They may have blinded themselves to your worth, but the earth remembers." Before she could process the weight of his declaration, the spell of their quiet sanctuary was shattered. What is the meaning of this? The roar belonged to Jackson Silverbane. The Alpha King was marching across the courtyard, his heavy boots crunching violently against the icy cobblestones. His face was a mask of furious, insulted disbelief. Behind him, Evelyn Voss stumbled, clutching her heavy violet lunar silk, her beautiful features twisted into a pale mask of horror. The cloying scent of poisoned honey, her signature viper root perfume, spilled into the crisp air, making Saren's stomach turn. Jackson stopped at the edge of the dead garden, refusing to step into the mud. He stared at the moonlit sovereign, his chest heaving. "King Silas, you disrespect my hospitality. You halt your column, ignore my welcoming guard, and soil your armor in the mud. For a barren, defective Omega, stand up. We have a boundary treaty to sign in the upper keep." Silas did not immediately stand. He kept his warm, rough hand wrapped around her smaller, icy fingers. He took a slow, deliberate breath, his intense stare never leaving the servant girl's face. He was giving her a moment of absolute focus, ensuring she knew that the shouting man meant absolutely nothing to him. Then, he released her hand and rose. When Silas Mooncrest stood to his full height, the sheer scale of his physical dominance became terrifyingly clear. He towered over the Alpha by several inches, his shoulders broad enough to eclipse the pale afternoon sun. The moment he turned his back on Saren to face his host, the protective warmth he had offered her vanished, replaced by an aura of suffocating, lethal intent. The 10,000 frost butterflies swirled agitatedly, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. A few of the glowing creatures detached from the swirling diadem and settled onto the warlord's dark cloak, weaving their luminescent magic into his armor. The Moonlit King did not brush them off. He wore her magic like a badge of honor. "You speak to me of disrespect," Silas said. His volume was not raised. He did not need to shout to command the space. The deep, rumbling cadence of his voice carried effortlessly across the silent, watching courtyard. "You invite me to your territory to negotiate the borders of the northern realms. Yet I arrived to find the true Luna of the highest ancient lineage bleeding in the mud, stripped of her birthright and replaced by a fraud. Jackson's face flushed a deep, violent crimson. She is no Luna. Her mark was defective. Her wolf is silent. She is a hollow vessel, completely useless to the future of our lands. I severed the fated tether by ancient right. The woman beside me is my chosen mate, and the true strength of this pack. Evelyn lifted her chin, trying to muster a look of regal authority, but her eyes kept darting nervously to the glowing swarm hovering above her sister's head. The viper root she had used for years to suppress the true Luna's inner wolf was supposed to be permanent. It was supposed to keep her weak, numb, and ordinary. The sudden manifestation of the mythical magic was a catastrophic failure of her meticulous poisoning. Saren remained kneeling in the dirt, observing the confrontation with her signature, bone-chilling calm. She did not rise to defend herself. She did not hurl accusations at the mistress. The truth was currently hovering above her head in a display of undeniable, ancient authority. She simply watched the men operate, noting how Silas deliberately kept his massive frame positioned between her and Jackson, acting as a physical shield. Silas repeated softly. He took one slow step forward. The ice beneath his armored boots cracked like a gunshot. The fated mate bond does not make mistakes, Silverbane. It was dormant because your pathetic, metallic blood was too weak to awaken it. It was dormant because she was suffocating in a court built on poison and lies. Jackson bared his teeth, his inner wolf surging forward to defend his territory. Watch your tone, Mooncrest. You are within my walls. I have 500 armed wolves in this keep. Do not test my patience over a discarded servant. The Moonlit King tilted his head. A dark, terrifying smile curved his lips. It was a smile completely devoid of humor. 500 wolves, he mused, against my column, against the vanguard of my court. He reached into the inner pocket of his heavy cloak and withdrew a thick roll of parchment, bound by a silver ribbon. The boundary treaty. The document that Jackson desperately needed to secure his eastern borders and guarantee trade for the coming winter. Silas held the parchment up between them. I came here to sign this, he continued, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper, to secure peace. But I do not forge treaties with blind fools who discard divine gifts in the dirt. I do not align my territory with a man who lets his true mate freeze while he warms his bed with a snake. Evelyn gasped, taking a step back. Jackson lunged forward, his hands curling into fists, but the captain of the Moonlit Guard, a massive brute covered in battle scars, stepped out of the column, his hand resting on the hilt of a broadsword. The entire visiting army shifted their weight simultaneously, a unified, terrifying display of lethal readiness. What do you want? The Alpha gritted out, realizing the political disaster unfolding before his eyes. He needed that agreement. If war was declared today, his lands would be overrun before the first snow fell. Name your price. You want trade concessions? You want the lower valley? Name it. I want her. The words hung in the freezing air. Saren blinked, her silvery gaze widening fractionally. She looked at the broad expanse of the warlord's back. He had not hesitated. He had not asked for land or gold or political leverage. He had demanded the forgotten woman in the dirt. Jackson stared at him, utterly bewildered. He looked past his rival to the mud-soaked girl, seeing only the plain grey wool, the dirty face, and the quiet, unnerving stare that had always made his skin crawl. He could not comprehend the value Silas saw. He did not understand the ancient magic, dismissing it as some freak anomaly of the dying garden. You want Saren? Jackson asked, a cruel, mocking laugh bubbling up in his chest. You would risk a war over a barren Omega. Take her. She is a burden to my kitchens and a stain on my gardens. If you wish to haul my garbage back to your pristine territory, I will gladly sign her over to you. The mistress smiled then, a venomous, relieved curve of her red lips. She assumed the king wanted her sister as a slave, a war prize to humiliate the host. As long as the girl was gone, Evelyn could finally secure her absolute reign, without the lingering threat of the true bloodline. Silas did not react to the insult. His control was absolute. He simply unrolled the parchment. He did not ask for a quill. He dragged his armored thumb across the sharp edge of his own pauldron, slicing the skin. With his own blood, he struck a heavy, dark line through the terms of the agreement, altering the ancient pact. "The boundary treaty holds," Silas declared, his voice echoing for the entire courtyard to witness. "But this keep formally relinquishes all claims, titles, and pack rights over Saren Frostmoor. She is no longer an exile of your territory. She is the sovereign charge of the Moonlit court. If any wolf bearing your crest crosses my borders to seek her, I will personally mount their head on a pike." Jackson swallowed hard, the metallic scent of his fear finally breaking through his arrogant pheromones. "Agreed," he spat. "Take her and leave." The warlord dropped the blood-stained parchment onto the icy ground at his rival's feet. The Alpha King was forced to kneel to retrieve it, inadvertently lowering himself before the very man who had just dismantled his pride. Turning his back on the pathetic display, Silas walked back to Saren. The luminous swarm parted for him once more, recognizing the unyielding loyalty in his storm-grey eyes. Saren had slowly pushed herself to her feet. Her legs were numb, her knees stained black with frozen mud. She stood tall, her spine as straight as it had been on the day of her rejection. She did not look at her former mate. She did not glance at her sister. Her entire focus was on the man who had just traded a kingdom's leverage for her life. "You did not have to do that," she said quietly. Silas stopped in front of her. He reached up to his shoulders and unclasped his heavy cloak. The garment was enormous, lined with the thickest, softest midnight fur, radiating a profound, trapped heat. With deliberate, reverent care, he draped the heavy fabric over her shivering shoulders. The sensory shock was immense. The warmth of the cloak instantly enveloped her, cutting off the biting wind. It smelled heavily of pine, dry hearth fire, and his deep instinctual scent. For the first time in 10 days, the violent shivering in her core began to subside. The heavy weight of the fabric felt like a physical shield against the hostility of the world. "I did," Silas replied, his voice softening only for her ears. He reached out and carefully adjusted the collar of the cloak, ensuring it completely covered the faint, jagged scar of her broken mating mark. "We are small things in a world of teeth, Saren. When we find something sacred, we do not leave it in the dark." He offered her his arm. He did not order her to follow. He did not grab her elbow or force her forward. He extended his armored forearm, giving her the absolute power of choice. Saren looked at the offered arm. She thought of the 3 years she had spent conforming to the brutal rules of this place, shrinking herself to fit into narrow, toxic expectations. She thought of the poison she had unknowingly consumed, and the silent agony of her broken wolf. Then, she looked at the glowing crown of winter hovering above her own head, and the terrifying, patient sovereign waiting for her decision, not used, not owned, chosen. She reached out from beneath the heavy folds of the midnight cloak and placed her hand on his armored forearm. A low, resonant horn blew from the vanguard of the column. The destriers stamped their hooves, turning perfectly in unison to face the massive iron gates of the courtyard. Silas guided her forward. They walked together, moving at a steady, dignified pace. The entire visiting army fell into formation around them, creating an impenetrable wall of dark steel and fur. As they passed the dais where Jackson and Evelyn stood clutching their altered treaty, Saren did not turn her head. She did not offer them a parting glance, a sneer, or a tear. She simply walked past them as if they were nothing more than ghosts haunting a dead keep. The ultimate insult was not anger. It was absolute, terrifying indifference. Silas easily hoisted her into the saddle of his massive black destrier before vaulting up behind her. He did not crowd her, keeping a respectful distance, but his massive frame blocked the harsh northern wind entirely. The frost butterflies swarmed around the horse, casting a brilliant, ethereal light over the entire column as they marched out of the courtyard. The heavy iron gates of the forsaken stronghold had long since slammed shut behind them, sealing the arrogant Alpha inside his own cold, hollow kingdom. The journey toward the moonlit territory began in profound silence. Saren sat rigidly in the saddle for the first hour, her mind struggling to process the violent shift in her reality. The frozen landscape blurred past them, a sea of white snow and dark, jagged pines. The physical exhaustion of the day, combined with the sudden awakening of her ancient magic, began to drag heavily on her consciousness. "You can sleep," Silas rumbled from behind her, his voice a low vibration against her back. "No harm will come to you here. You have my word." Saren stared out at the sprawling, unbroken expanse of the winter woods. The frost butterflies had settled into the heavy fur of her borrowed cloak, pulsing faintly like captured stars. Her inner wolf, finally feeling the secure, unshakable perimeter of a true protector, curled up in the safety of her mind and closed its eyes. For the first time in years, Saren let her straight spine relax. She leaned back slightly, allowing the heavy, warm presence of the Moonlit King to carry her weight. She closed her weary eyes, sinking into the quiet, safe dark. The rhythmic, thunderous gait of the massive black Destria became the pendulum by which Saren measured the passage of time. For the first hour of the journey, she remained entirely rigid against the Dark Sovereign's armored chest. Her muscles, locked in a perpetual state of defensive tension for 3 long years, refused to understand that the immediate threat had vanished. She unconsciously braced for a sudden cruelty, a harsh word, a tightening of the grip around her waist that would cross the line from protective to possessive. But Silas Mooncrest did not shift. His left arm remained an immovable iron bar, securing her safely in the saddle, without once pulling her flush against him in a demand for physical intimacy. He offered her absolute structural support, and nothing more. It was a terrifyingly respectful boundary. Even as she drifted into a state of hazy, exhausted unconsciousness, the reality of the afternoon felt like a fevered illusion. The realm operated on whispers, and Saren knew that by tomorrow, the northern winds would carry the impossible story to every corner of the frozen territories. Soon, every tavern and border watchtower would share the exact sequence of events in hushed, reverent tones. They would tell the tale of how Silas Mooncrest followed the freezing magical current to the mud-soaked gardens, where he witnessed Saren Frostmore surrounded by glowing frost butterflies, and knelt in the mud before her in absolute recognition. The historians of the Inner Keeps would endlessly debate the political madness of the act. They would document how the Moonlit King demanded Saren's release under threat of war, and how Jackson arrogantly agreed, relinquishing his supposedly worthless ex-Luna as Saren watched in dignified silence. The legend was already taking root in the ice, a transfer of power that would shatter the hierarchy of the territories forever. Miles behind the traveling column, the heavy iron gates had long since slammed shut, but the echoing finality of the sound still rattled deep in Jackson Silverbane's skull. The Alpha King stood motionless in the frozen mud of the northern terrace, staring at the exact coordinates where the moonlit sovereign had knelt. The winter wind howled down from the jagged mountain peaks, but it provided no clarity to his racing mind. The dead garden was entirely empty now. The single frost blossom that had bloomed with blinding, luminescent silver light was already blackening at the edges. Without Saren's physical presence and the ancient magic of her bloodline to sustain it, the sacred plant was rapidly crumbling into dark, lifeless ash. Jackson looked down at the boundary treaty clutched in his gloved hand. The thick slash of Silas's blood across the parchment felt like a physical, bleeding wound against his pride. He had secured his eastern borders. He had guaranteed the trade routes for the coming winter. He had successfully discarded a barren, defective mate in favor of a strong mistress. He had achieved every political maneuver he desired. So why did the ambient temperature of his keep suddenly feel distinctly hollow? As his inner wolf paced frantically within his chest, a sickening biological realization began to settle in his marrow. The fated mate bond was not merely a ceremonial title, it was the spiritual anchor of the territory. By violently severing the tether and casting out the true Luna, he had not just broken Saren, he had torn a fundamental piece of magic from the bedrock of the entire territory. Evelyn Voss stood a few paces behind him, her arms wrapped tightly around her heavy violet Luna silk. The cloying scent of her poisoned honey perfume was rapidly being overpowered by the biting scent of ozone and impending snow. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs, a frantic, terrified rhythm. The viper root poison had failed. She had spent 3 agonizing years secretly grinding the toxic root into Saren's daily meals, meticulously suppressing her sister's inner wolf and keeping the fated royal lineage utterly dormant. It was supposed to be a flawless, undetectable sabotage. She was supposed to wear the crown without challenge. But the sudden, violent manifestation of the mythical frost butterflies meant that the sheer physical trauma of the severed bond had somehow burned through the chemical restraint. The true magic of the ancient deities was awake, and Evelyn knew with terrifying certainty that a stolen crown could not protect her from the wrath of the earth itself. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and placed a hand on Jackson's arm to offer comfort. The Alpha King flinched. He did not turn to look at her. With a sharp, irritable motion, he shrugged off her touch, his turbulent gaze remaining fixed on the blackened ashes of the dead flower. The perfect, arrogant alliance they had forged in the shadows was already beginning to fracture under the weight of Silas's absolute indifference. By the time the vanguard of the moonlit court halted for the night, the sky had turned a bruised, deep violet, bleeding rapidly into the absolute black of true night. They made camp in a sheltered, hidden ravine guarded by towering, ancient pines. The trees were massive, their thick, needle-laden branches forming a natural canopy that blocked the worst of the falling snow and the biting northern wind. Silas brought the massive destrier to a gentle halt. He did not issue loud, barking orders to his men. A series of low, precise hand signals was all it took for the elite guard to dismount and begin establishing a secure perimeter. The discipline of the Moonlit wolves was a stark, jarring contrast to the chaotic, aggressive posturing of Jackson's pack. There was no chest beating. There were no dominance displays. They moved with a lethal, quiet efficiency, their dark cloaks blending seamlessly into the shadows of the forest. "We stop here," Silas murmured, his voice a low vibration that drew Saren slowly from her exhausted stupor. She blinked, her weary eyes heavy and unfocused. The biological shock of the day had finally caught up to her. When Silas effortlessly vaulted from the saddle and reached up to lift her down, her legs completely gave out the moment. Her boots touched the packed snow. She had run on pure adrenaline, stoicism, and survival instinct for 10 days in the freezing dirt. Now, the sudden introduction of absolute safety was a physical shock to her system. Her knees buckled. Silas caught her before she could fall. He did not make a dramatic spectacle of her weakness. He simply adjusted his grip, lifting her entirely into his arms with a terrifying, effortless strength. Saren stiffened, her breath catching in her throat, but the heavy midnight fur cloak insulated her from the cold steel of his armor. He carried her through the bustling camp as if she weighed absolutely nothing. The moonlit guards immediately stepped aside, clearing a wide path to the center of the ravine. Saren noticed a crucial detail that made the breath lodge sideways in her lungs. The wolves did not stare. In the inner circles, the pack had always watched her with open mockery, tracking her every movement to find a flaw, a stumble, a reason to laugh. Here, the heavily armed warriors deliberately averted their eyes as their king carried her past. They lowered their chins in a synchronized display of profound, instinctual respect. They treated her like a sovereign without needing a formal decree, simply because their warlord had chosen to shield her. Silas set her gently onto a bed of thick, dry furs, positioned near a massive hearth fire his men had rapidly constructed. The heat of the roaring flames was intense. For 10 days, Saren had existed in a state of perpetual, agonizing numbness. The outer gardens were where you went to be forgotten, a place where the cold seeped into the bones and stayed there. Now, the sudden introduction of burning gold and crackling wood smoke felt almost abrasive against her pale, frozen skin. The capillary response in her fingertips brought a painful, prickling sensation as her dormant blood finally began to thaw. She pulled the midnight cloak tighter around her shoulders, shivering violently as the temperature differential shocked her core. The faint, jagged scar on her collarbone, the physical remnant where the sacred thread woven between their souls had been stretched, torn, and bled dry by Jackson, throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. Silas disappeared into the shadows of the camp, only to return a few moments later, holding a carved wooden bowl. Steam billowed from the surface of the rich, dark liquid. He knelt beside the furs and offered it to her. "Drink," he rumbled softly. "It is a heavy broth of marrow and winter root. It will anchor the heat in your blood." Saren reached out, her hands trembling so badly she nearly spilled the contents. Silas did not withdraw his hands entirely. He kept his large, calloused fingers hovering just beneath the bowl, offering a silent, structural net in case she dropped it. The heat of the wood transferred to her cracked skin. The layer of crystalline ice from the frost butterfly still protected the deep laceration on her right palm, but the rest of her knuckles were raw and bleeding. She brought the bowl to her pale lips and drank. The broth was scalding, tasting of salt, rich meat, and earthy herbs. It was the most magnificent thing she had ever consumed. The liquid burned a path down her throat, instantly warming the freezing, empty cavern in her chest. She took another desperate swallow, and then another, until the bowl was half empty. She did not realize she had closed her eyes until she opened them again and found the Moonlit King watching her with an unreadable expression. "Thank you," she rasped, her voice barely above a whisper. Silas took the bowl and set it aside in the snow. Then he did something that completely shattered the fragile remnants of her worldview. He reached up and unbuckled the heavy midnight steel gauntlets from his forearms. The metallic clanking sounded impossibly loud in the quiet camp. He set the armor aside, exposing his bare hands and the thick, corded muscles of his forearms. He reached for a small iron kettle resting near the edge of the fire, pouring steaming water over a clean, folded cloth. With deliberate, agonizingly slow caution, Silas moved closer to her. He did not ask for permission, but his eyes never left hers, offering her every opportunity to pull away. He reached down and carefully rolled up the frayed hem of her mud-soaked grey wool dress. Saren's breath hitched. For 3 years, physical touch had been a weapon. It had been a grip on the arm to forcefully guide her, a rough shove to the side, or Jackson violently tearing her collar to expose her defective mark to a laughing crowd. Intimacy was a battlefield she had learned to navigate with complete frozen silence. Silas's touch was none of those things. It was beautiful the way a blade was beautiful, hiding immense, lethal power behind a flawless, disciplined control. His large, warm hands were impossibly gentle. He took the steaming cloth and began to carefully wipe away the frozen black dirt from her calves and knees. Her skin was bruised a deep, mottled purple, scraped and bleeding from kneeling in the unforgiving earth of Jackson's domain. Saren sat entirely frozen, Her sharp irises shifted for a fraction of a second, tracking his every micro-movement. She waited for the trap. She waited for the massive warlord to look up and demand gratitude, to demand submission in exchange for his care. No man possessed this much power without exacting a toll. He did not look up. He focused entirely on the task, treating her battered skin with the absolute reverence of a scholar, handling a sacred, fragile text. He rinsed the cloth in the hot water and returned to her bruised knees, meticulously washing away the grime of her exile. The warm water ran in soothing rivulets down her skin. "You do not have to do this," Saren said, her voice tight with the effort of holding back a sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion. She refused to cry. Dignity was her ultimate shield, and she would not discard it now. Silas paused. He kept one hand resting warmly against her calf, grounding her, while he finally lifted his gaze to meet hers. The firelight cast flickering, golden shadows across the harsh, angular planes of his face. His sharp irises shifted for a fraction of a second, the edges of his irises burning with a protective, molten gold as his inner wolf pushed forward to inspect her wounds. "A king who cannot kneel to mend what his peers have broken is no king at all," Silas replied, the tectonic rumble of his voice carrying an absolute, undeniable truth. "You were meant to be the highest sovereign of this era, Saren. I will wash the dirt from your skin until you remember what it feels like to be clean." The sheer sincerity in his tone was devastating. It bypassed her logical defenses and struck directly at the silent, broken wolf residing in her mind. Her inner wolf let out a soft, involuntary whimper, not of fear, but of profound relief. As the physical relaxation of her muscles forced a deep, involuntary exhale from her lungs, the ambient magic of the camp responded. The magical coronet, which had gone dormant and melted into the fur of her cloak during the exhausting ride, suddenly awakened. A dozen luminescent frost butterflies fluttered out from the dark folds of the midnight fabric. They danced in the space between them, their crystalline wings catching the golden light of the hearth fire. One of the glowing creatures descended slowly, hovering over Silas's bare hand where it rested against her leg. The delicate magic did not sting him. It did not freeze his blood. It simply settled onto his knuckles, a pulsing, spidery pattern of ice that radiated pure, ancient approval. The magic of the winter gods recognized the man who had traded a kingdom's leverage for a forgotten servant. Saren stared at the glowing butterfly on his hand, and then up into the face of the terrifying sovereign who had vowed to protect her. A name unspoken for years grows teeth, but a silent woman finally given a safe hearth grows an empire. She leaned back against the dry furs, the biting cold of the past finally beginning to vanish from her memory, replaced entirely by the scent of pine, starlight, and the steady, protective heartbeat of the Moonlit King. The rest of the journey deeper into the Moonlit territory was marked by a profound, elemental shift in the atmosphere. By the time the heavily armed vanguard crossed the invisible boundary, separating the neutral northern woods from Silas Mooncrest's sovereign lands, the biting, hostile wind that had plagued Saren Frostmoor for years simply ceased to exist. It was not a sudden warming of the climate, but rather a transformation in the fundamental nature of the cold itself. The air here was pristine, crisp, and heavily saturated with the scent of ancient pine and cold starlight. It was a cold that did not seek to punish, bite, or numb. It was a cold that preserved, filtering into her exhausted lungs with a clean, resonant clarity. Saren sat quietly in the saddle, the heavy midnight fur cloak wrapped securely around her shoulders. For 3 agonizing years in Jackson Silverbane's oppressive court, her heightened senses had been constantly assaulted by the suffocating stench of metallic ozone, fear, and the aggressive, posturing pheromones of a hierarchy built on cruelty. Every hallway of her former prison had echoed with loud, boasting voices and the chaotic clamor of wolves desperate to assert their dominance. Here, Surrounded by the silent, disciplined elite guard of the Moonlit pack, that sensory overload entirely vanished. The quiet was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, synchronized crunch of the massive destria's hooves against the packed snow. She closed her striking eyes and focused strictly on the physical sensations radiating from her own body, a survival tactic she had perfected in the frozen dirt of her exile. The most immediate, jarring change was the state of the jagged scar on her left collarbone. When the fated mate bond had been violently severed in the great hall, the recoil had left a burning, raw crater in her spiritual and biological anatomy. It had throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache every time her heart beat, a constant agonizing reminder of her displacement and public humiliation. But as she inhaled the crisp, pine-scented air of the warlord's territory, the severe inflammation began to recede. The ambient magic of the land, a deep, ancient power that intrinsically recognized the blood of the winter gods running through her veins, acted as a soothing environmental balm. The phantom burning slowly cooled into a manageable, distant pressure, allowing her muscles to uncoil a fraction of an inch. Behind her, Silas remained a pillar of immovable, structural support. The Dark Sovereign did not crowd her in the saddle. He maintained the exact same terrifyingly respectful boundary he had established since lifting her from the freezing mud of the dead garden. His large, calloused hands held the leather reins with casual, lethal grace, his armored chest providing a solid, unyielding anchor against the rhythmic sway of the massive horse. He did not ask her to speak. He did not demand she recount the trauma of her public rejection or the agonizing details of her exile. He simply allowed her to exist in the quiet, safe dark of his protection. It was a silent testament to his character, proving that true sovereign power did not need to physically dominate or coerce to maintain absolute control. He was a creature of immense violence, yet he treated her with the fragile care normally reserved for spun glass. "Are you warm enough?" Silas rumbled suddenly, his voice a low, tectonic vibration that traveled through the armor plate and settled deep in her marrow. Saren blinked, her eyes fluttering open as she looked out at the passing tree line. "I am," she replied softly. The midnight fur cloak was a furnace against her shivering core, carrying the deep, instinctual scent of his absolute safety. The thick material shielded her not just from the weather, but from the terrifying reality of her sudden displacement. Silas did not press further. He simply adjusted his left arm slightly, blocking a stray gust of northern wind from catching the fraying hem of her grey wool dress. The micro-gesture of unprompted care was entirely alien to her. In Jackson's court, a shiver was seen as a weakness to be exploited, not a discomfort to be remedied. When the dense, ancient tree line finally broke, the celestial court of the Moonlit territory came into magnificent view. Saren's breath hitched, not out of the familiar, suffocating fear she was accustomed to, but from the sheer, staggering beauty of the stronghold. Her former fortress had been a cavernous, oppressive expanse of black stone, brutally designed to humble the weak and Project Terror. In stark contrast, Silas's keep was a sprawling architectural marvel, carved directly into the pale, luminescent stone of the mountain itself. Massive spires of polished grey marble reached elegantly toward the night sky, their smooth surfaces catching the moonlight and glowing with a soft, ethereal silver radiance. Bridges of beautifully wrought silver spanned deep, starlit chasms connecting the various wings of the palace. Warm, inviting golden light spilled from thousands of high-arched windows, casting a welcoming glow over the snow-covered valley. It did not look like a militant fortress perpetually preparing for war. It looked like an ancient, sacred sanctuary that had stood undisturbed and unthreatened for millennia. The armed column rode through the towering front gates without a single horn blast, shouted command, or frantic scramble of servants. The heavy iron portcullis had already been raised, the perimeter guards standing at absolute silent attention in the shadows. When Silas directed the black destrier into the expansive inner courtyard, Saren braced herself entirely out of conditioned habit. She expected the cruel sneers. She prepared her mind for the mocking whispers, the hostile, judging stares of an inner circle, eager to size up the broken, defective Omega their king had inexplicably dragged home from a rival territory. She tightened her grip on the thick fur edge of the midnight cloak, keeping her spine perfectly straight and her chin elevated. She would not let them see her break. Instead, the sprawling courtyard was a sea of profound, dignified silence. Hundreds of moonlit wolves, ranging from elite warriors to common tradespeople, had gathered in the freezing night to witness the return of their sovereign. But they did not push forward, bare their teeth, or demand a spectacle. As the horse came to a halt in the center of the square, the entire assembly moved in a synchronized, breathtaking wave of respect. They did not drop to their knees in fearful, cowering submission. They bowed their heads deeply, exposing their throats in a display of absolute voluntary loyalty, and their deference was not directed solely at the terrifying warlord. Saren noticed, with a sudden tightening in her throat, that their eyes deliberately averted from her face. They were offering the silent, battered woman the physical space and flawless dignity she had been starved of for 3 long years. They treated her not as a discarded prize of war, but as a sovereign charge who demanded ultimate reverence. Silas dismounted first, the heavy steel of his boots landing silently on the pristine, snow-swept cobblestones. He turned and reached up for her. He did not issue a sharp command for her to descend. He did not grab her waist or impatiently pull her down. He simply offered his large, warm hands, waiting with infinite patience for her voluntary choice to step into his care. Saren looked down at the towering warlord, a man who possessed enough military might to crush entire kingdoms to ash, completely content to wait for a forgotten servant girl's permission. She slowly reached out from beneath the heavy folds of the cloak and placed her bruised hands in his. Silas lifted her from the saddle with effortless, fluid grace, setting her gently onto the solid ground. The exact moment the soles of her boots touched the moonlit stone, a singular, delicate frost butterfly detached itself from the heavy fur of her collar. It fluttered upward, glowing with a soft, luminescent silver light, and slowly circled the warlord's dark hair before dissipating into the crisp night air in a shower of icy sparks. The surrounding pack witnessed the sacred display of ancient magic, their collective posture softening even further into a state of profound awe. "Welcome to the Moonlit Court, Saren," Silas rumbled quietly, his storm-grey eyes reflecting the golden light of the courtyard lanterns. "Here, you will never need to make yourself unseen again." Saren did not offer a sweeping, dramatic declaration of gratitude. She did not weep. She simply nodded, her storm-glass eyes reflecting the golden light of the courtyard lanterns. For the first time since the brutal rejection ceremony was supposed to break her spine, the freezing, empty cavern in her chest felt like it had finally found a permanent hearth. As Silas gently guided her forward, the massive, iron-studded oak doors of the keep groaned open, revealing a cavernous entry hall glowing with the warm amber light of 100 sconces. The rhythmic, synchronized crunch of the vanguard's boots faded into a muffled hush as they crossed the threshold, stepping from the biting frost of the open courtyard into the insulated, wood-smoke-scented stone corridors of the inner stronghold. The transition from the crisp, freezing air of the outer world to the inner sanctum of the keep was seamless. Silas did not lead her down a winding staircase to a damp dungeon, nor did he direct her to a neglected servants' quarter. In the lower rings, he guided her directly to the royal healing wing, a sprawling, circular chamber located deep within the very heart of the mountain's core. The room was a masterclass in sensory warmth and deliberate comfort. A massive hearth fire roared against the far stone wall, casting flickering, golden light across the polished wooden floorboards. The atmosphere was thick with the restorative, earthy scents of dried winter root, crushed sage, and warm wild honey, completely overwriting the lingering smell of ozone and fear that clung to Saren's memory. Waiting patiently for them in the center of the room was Orla Thorne. The head healer of the Moonlit territory was a woman of indeterminate age, her long silver hair woven into a complex traditional braid that trailed down her straight back. Her eyes were sharp, deeply observant, and completely devoid of the arrogant, condescending cruelty Saren had come to expect from anyone holding a position of authority. "My king," Orla said, bowing her head briefly in a gesture of deep respect before turning her absolute, unblinking focus to the quiet woman wrapped in the oversized midnight cloak. The wise healer did not ask unnecessary, probing questions about the politics of the old keep. She simply gestured with a weathered hand toward a wide, thickly padded examination table positioned near the roaring fire. "Bring her here. The cold has been sitting in her bones for far too long." Saren moved toward the table, her steps slow but remarkably steady. Silas followed closely behind her, but he deliberately stopped a few paces away, sinking back into the deep shadows cast by the hearth. He crossed his massive, heavily muscled arms over his armored chest, his physical presence acting as an immovable iron bar of protection. He was silently ensuring that Saren knew he would never leave her alone or vulnerable in an unfamiliar room, while simultaneously giving the medical expert the physical space required to work. Orla approached the table with quiet, deliberate movements, her hands open and visible. "May I touch you, child?" she asked, her voice carrying a maternal grounding weight that demanded no submission. Saren gave a tight, microscopic nod. The healer carefully pulled back the heavy, fur-lined edges of the midnight cloak, exposing the pale, bruised skin of Saren's neck and the jagged, raised scar of the broken mating mark. Orla's bare fingers were remarkably warm. She pressed her fingertips gently against the damaged tissue over the collarbone, meticulously tracking the erratic pulse points along Saren's throat. The older woman frowned, a deep, troubling crease forming between her silver brows. She moved her hands down to Saren's wrists, pressing her thumbs firmly against the fragile, bruised veins visible beneath the pale skin. The silence in the healing wing stretched taut, punctuated only by the sharp crackle of the burning logs and the slow, rhythmic, heavy breathing of the Moonlit King watching from the shadows. The biological trauma of a violently severed bond is always severe, Orla murmured, her tone analytical, speaking more to the anatomical mystery than to her patient. But this physiological state is something else entirely. Your core temperature is artificially suppressed. Your inner wolf is not just dormant from the devastating shock of the alpha's rejection. It is heavily, chemically chained. Saren's brow furrowed, a flicker of genuine confusion breaking through her stoic mask. "Chemically," she rasped, her voice tight and dry. "I was told my mark was defective by birth, that I was a barren, hollow vessel incapable of shifting." Orla scoffed, a short, sharp sound of absolute, unfiltered medical disgust. Only a blind fool or a malicious liar would look at the blood of the ancient deities and call it hollow. The healer turned sharply toward a heavy oak medical cabinet, retrieving a small, perfectly clear crystal diagnostic vial and a sterilized silver needle. She walked back to the examination table with grim purpose. "Hold out your hand." Saren extended her right hand, the one that still bore the beautiful crystalline ice left behind by the frost butterfly's healing touch. Orla gently pricked the soft pad of Saren's index finger, allowing a single heavy drop of dark blood to fall directly into the center of the clear crystal vial. For a long, agonizing moment, the blood simply rested at the bottom of the glass. Then Orla murmured a low, ancient diagnostic incantation, brushing her thumbs slowly over the rim of the vial. The clear crystal instantly reacted, turning a violent, murky, and sickly shade of green. As the chemical reaction completed, a thick, cloying scent of poisoned honey violently filled the warm air of the healing wing. Saren stopped breathing entirely, her piercing gaze locked onto the noxious green liquid with terrifying recognition. She knew that exact, distinct smell. It was the signature fragrance that Evelyn Voss wore every single day. It was the scent that lingered heavily in the halls of the royal compound, the scent that clung to the heavy violet, lunar silk, and most damning of all, it was the specific aroma of the morning restorative teas her sister had meticulously prepared and hand-delivered to her chambers over the last 3 years. Viper root poison, Orla stated, her voice turning completely glacial as she identified the toxin. She set the vial down on a metal tray with a sharp, echoing clink. It is a slow-acting, highly controlled and heavily outlawed neurotoxin. Administered in small daily doses, it binds the bone marrow, drastically drops the core body temperature, and completely paralyzes the inner wolf's connection to the nervous system. It mimics the biological symptoms of a defective omega perfectly. Whoever has been feeding this poison to you was executing a systematic, multi-year campaign to suppress your royal lineage and ensure your fated magic never awakened. The sheer, horrifying magnitude of the betrayal hit Saren like a physical, blunt force blow to the chest. The public rejection ceremony at the altar had been a devastating execution of her dignity, but this was a calculated, biological assassination. Her sister had not merely stolen her wedding dress or opportunistically seduced her mate. Evelyn had methodically poisoned her own blood relative, smiling softly every single morning as she handed Saren the toxic porcelain cup, all to secure a faith-fitted throne that never belonged to her. The cold distortion of her true worth had been systemic, chemical, and absolute, yet Saren did not cry. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the violation burned away any lingering capacity for tears. Instead, a terrifying absolute calm settled over her pale features. She looked down at her own hands, slowly cataloguing the calluses, earned from the frozen dirt, the deep scars from her forced menial labor, and the dormant, powerful magic humming just beneath her skin. For 3 years, she had genuinely believed she was broken. She had swallowed the cruel jests of the inner pack and maintained an unbent spine, believing she was stoically bearing a natural, biological flaw. She had never been weak. She had been enduring a lethal, agonizing poison through sheer, unimaginable willpower and surviving it. In the deep shadows by the roaring hearth, the ambient temperature in the room violently plummeted. Silas Mooncrest had not moved a single inch, but the air around him began to visibly warp with the sheer, unadulterated violence of his fury. His metallic gaze had shifted completely, burning with a bright, terrifying molten gold. The steady, tectonic rumble that usually laced his breathing was gone, replaced by a deadly, suffocating silence that made the shadows physically tremble. He stared intently at the vial of poisoned blood, the full realization of what Evelyn and Jackson had done to his fated charge echoing like a war drum through his mind. The terrifying warlord wanted nothing more than to immediately march his vanguard back across the border, tear the gates of the mountain fortress from their hinges, and reduce the entire arrogant, blind court to a mountain of smoking, blood-soaked ash. But when Silas's primal inner wolf surged forward, roaring for immediate blood and apocalyptic retribution, he looked at Saren. He saw her sitting perfectly still on the examination table, quietly processing the absolute destruction of her reality. If he unleashed his predatory aura now, if he allowed his monstrous, righteous anger to completely fill the small room, he would only frighten her. He would become just another dangerous, uncontrollable, dominant alpha in a life already destroyed by them. With a massive, agonizing physical effort of will, Silas gripped the edge of the heavy stone mantle beside him. The solid, ancient rock cracked under the immense pressure of his bare, white-knuckled hand, a jagged fissure violently spider-webbing up the wall. He forced his molten gold eyes to cool back to a stormy grey. He violently reined in his lethal aura, shoving the monstrous, protective fury deep down into the dark, choosing absolute, painful physical restraint solely for the sake of her emotional safety. He utterly refused to let his anger eclipse her moment of realization. Saren watched the massive warlord break the solid stone mantle, simply to keep himself from breaking the world on her behalf. The physical manifestation of his brutal self-control was the most profoundly intimate thing she had ever witnessed. It was a silent, unshakable promise, etched forever in shattered rock, that his terrifying power would never, ever be used against her. Her inner wolf, finally realizing it was not a defective, pathetic creature, but a chained, ancient queen, suddenly rose from the dark void of her mind. The daily dose of viper root poison was no longer being administered, and the violent biological shock of the broken bond had permanently shattered its chemical hold, leaving the door wide open for the true magic to flow. The wolf released a low, resonant, bone-rattling snarl that vibrated through Saren's very spine, demanding the space it had been denied for years. Above her head, the warm air of the healing wing violently shimmered. 10,000 luminescent frost butterflies materialized out of nothing, swarming into a brilliant, pulsing vortex of pure ancient magic. The sacred crown of winter had returned in full force, manifesting not in response to her silent suffering, but in magnificent response to her glorious awakening. The delicate creatures fluttered around her dark hair, their icy wings casting a radiant, silvery glow that illuminated the dark corners of the stone room. Orla turned back to the hearth, lifting a heavy iron kettle from the flames. She poured a thick, steaming portion of marrow and winter root broth into a wide wooden bowl. The heavy, restorative liquid was a stark contrast to the delicate, poisoned porcelain teas of her past. It smelled of marrow, crushed herbs, and survival. Orla pressed the warm bowl into Saren's hands. "Drink, my queen. Restore the heat to your blood. You have a kingdom to reclaim." Saren brought the bowl to her lips, the hot broth instantly sending a wave of profound, anchoring warmth through her frozen chest. The physical shivering finally, permanently ceased. "How long until the poison is entirely purged from my blood?" Saren asked quietly. Her voice was no longer the dry rasp of a broken servant. It rang with a new, undisguised and absolute sovereign authority. Orla Thorne immediately bowed her head deeply to the true, undeniable queen of the Northern Realms. "A matter of weeks, my queen. The ancient winter magic is already burning it away from your marrow." Saren looked at the shattered stone mantle, and then directly into the eyes of the Moonlit king. Her former home had built its entire foundation on a venomous, orchestrated lie, and a lie could never survive the incoming thaw. By the second week of her sanctuary, the daily ritual had forged a quiet rhythm between them. Saren sat by the roaring hearth, her hands wrapped around an empty wooden bowl, while Silas occupied a low stone bench opposite her, methodically polishing a steel bracer in comfortable silence. "The trembling in your hands has stopped," he observed softly, his stormy eyes tracking the steady natural warmth returning to her pale skin. Saren looked down at her fingers, watching a singular, nascent frost butterfly manifest briefly above her knuckles before dissolving into a mist of silver sparks. "The poison is breaking," she murmured, and for the first time in 3 years, her voice carried the unyielding, resonant steel of her true lineage. The passage of time was no longer measured by the excruciating, slow drip of survival, but by the steady rhythmic drumbeat of genuine healing. 4 weeks had passed since Saren Frostmore first crossed the threshold of the Royal Healing Wing. The biological trauma of the violently severed bond A vicious wound that was supposed to leave her a shivering, hollow vessel for the rest of her abbreviated life had been entirely eradicated. The daily, meticulous regimen of steaming marrow and winter root broth had slowly, miraculously rebuilt her broken body from within. Every cup of the heavy, earthy liquid had seeped deep into the frozen caverns of her bones, systematically flushing the insidious viper root toxin from her bloodstream and restoring the ancient, sacred heat she had been denied for years. The recovery was not just physical, it was a profound spiritual awakening. For 3 years, she had genuinely believed her inner wolf was a defective, pathetic creature. Now, completely unchained from the chemical suppression of her sister's treason, the magnificent beast paced the expansive landscape of her mind with robust, sovereign confidence. The jagged, raised scar on her left collarbone, the physical remnant where the sacred thread had been torn, had faded into a thin, pearlescent line. It no longer ached with the phantom pain of a lost connection. It was simply a closed door, a silent testament to a cage she had successfully survived. Saren stood alone on the private, upper terraces of the Moonlit Gardens, breathing in the crisp, pristine air. The sanctuary was a masterclass in ancient, celestial architecture. Massive tiered planters carved from pale, luminescent grey marble cascaded down the mountainside, blanketed in a layer of untouched, glittering snow that resembled a sea of crushed diamonds under the eternal twilight. She was no longer dressed in the ragged, mud-stained grey wool of a forgotten servant. Orla Thorn had presented her with garments befitting the highest authority of the northern realms, a sweeping, elegant gown of dark, heavy wool threaded intricately with spun silver. The heavy midnight fur cloak rested comfortably over her shoulders, its thick pelt smelling eternally of pine, wood smoke, and the absolute safety of the man who had provided it. The ambient temperature on the high terrace was well below freezing, sharp enough to crack ordinary stone, but Saren did not shiver. The biting chill no longer sought to punish her. Instead, it felt like an old, welcoming friend. The cold was finally hers to command. She reached out, her bare, unscarred fingers brushing gently against the delicate petals of a massive frost blossom growing from the nearest marble planter. Unlike the dying, blackened flora of Jackson Silverbane's dead, hostile garden, the plants in the Moonlit territory thrived under her proximity. The moment her warm skin made contact, the flower pulsed with a brilliant, bioluminescent silver light. A single, crystalline frost butterfly detached itself from the blooming petals. It fluttered upward, leaving a trail of shimmering stardust in its wake, and seamlessly joined the dormant, swirling halo of ancient magic that perpetually rested just above her dark hair. The sacred silver diadem was no longer a frantic, defensive manifestation. It was a calm, eternal crown of sovereign right. The heavy, synchronized crunch of armored boots against the packed snow broke the absolute, meditative silence of the terrace. Saren did not flinch, nor did her muscles lock into the familiar, defensive tension that had governed her life in the past. She simply turned, her cool gaze softening, as she watched Silas Mooncrest approach through the garden. The legendary warlord moved, with a slow, deliberate cadence, his massive frame clad in his signature midnight steel armor. The celestial runes etched into the dark metal absorbed the ambient starlight, projecting an aura of terrifying lethal grace that kept the rest of the kingdom at a vast awed distance. Yet, as always when he entered her presence, he had left his heavy, spiked gauntlets behind. His large, calloused hands were completely bare, a physical promise that he brought no cold iron into her personal space. His captivating eyes were fixed entirely on her face, completely ignoring the breathtaking expanse of the snow-covered valley, stretching out for miles below them. "You should not be out here alone," Silas rumbled gently, the tectonic vibration of his voice carrying effortlessly through the crisp air. He stopped exactly 3 paces away. He maintained that terrifyingly respectful boundary, a physical distance he had meticulously guarded for an entire month to give her the psychological space to heal without the overwhelming pressure of an Alpha's proximity. The northern winds are shifting, Saren. A storm is gathering at the lower pass. I am not cold, Silas, the true Luna replied, her voice carrying the quiet, absolute resonance of a woman who had finally realized her own undeniable worth. She took a slow, deliberate step toward him, consciously choosing to close the gap he had so carefully maintained. The winter and I understand each other perfectly now. Silas watched her move, his jaw tightening slightly as a muscle feathered in his angular cheek. The physical manifestation of his immense, agonizing self-control was palpable. For 4 weeks, he had treated her with the fragile, breathless reverence normally reserved for sacred relics, constantly keeping his primal, territorial, inner wolf chained in the dark so his overwhelming aura would never trigger her trauma. But Saren was no longer a broken Omega needing a passive shield. She was an awakened queen, completely ready to stand as an equal beside her king. She closed the final distance between them. Without a single word of hesitation, she reached up from beneath the heavy folds of the midnight cloak and placed her bare, warm hand flat against the center of his armored chest, right over his beating heart. The Moonlit King stopped breathing entirely. The sensory relief of the unforced, safe physical touch was immense. Silas closed his weary eyes, his chin bowing slightly as he leaned into the warmth of her small hand. A subtle shudder racked his massive frame. Not from the freezing mountain air, but from the overwhelming, agonizing relief of being chosen voluntarily. He had spent his entire existence conquering external threats, building a brutal reputation of dark steel and violence to protect his pack, entirely convinced that his lethal, cursed nature meant he would never be afforded the grace of a gentle, domestic touch. Now, her steady hand against his breastplate unraveled decades of absolute, bitter isolation in a single second. "The celestial amphitheater is prepared," Silas whispered, his voice incredibly rough, completely stripped of its usual militant dominance. "The northern lords have answered the summons and gathered in the upper rings. Jackson has crossed our borders. His territory is rotting from the inside out, the soil actively rejecting his rule since the hour he severed your bond and fractured the earth's magic. He comes to beg for the very agricultural resources and warding protection he arrogantly assumed he would never need." Saren kept her hand pressed firmly against his chest, cataloguing the heavy, rapid thumping of his heart beneath the cold steel. "And what will the warlord of the mountain offer him?" Silas opened his eyes. The storm-grey irises had shifted completely into a burning molten gold, yet the gaze was entirely devoid of coercion or aggression. It was pure, unadulterated devotion. Slowly, deliberately, the most feared sovereign in the realm went down on one knee on the snow-swept marble terrace. He did not care about the freezing slush, soaking his greaves, his terrifying status, or his kingly pride. He knelt before the quiet woman with the unbent spine, looking up at her with absolute, unwavering reverence. "I offer him nothing but the bitter ash of his own making," Silas vowed, his deep voice vibrating through the very stones of the terrace, an oath sworn to the marrow. He reached up with his bare hand and gently covered her fingers, pressing his warm lips against her unscarred knuckles. "My military strength, my starlight court, my life, they belong entirely to the true queen of the ancient packs. I will not conquer for you, Saren. I will stand completely still beside you while you take back what is yours. Tell me to reduce his keep to dust, and I will march the vanguard tonight." A dozen luminescent frost butterflies fluttered down from the glowing circlet, swirling beautifully around the kneeling warlord. They dusted his dark armor with shimmering, crystalline starlight, the magic of the celestial ancestors recognizing his unyielding loyalty and accepting his sovereign oath. Saren looked down at the terrifying protector who had voluntarily tamed his most dangerous instincts solely for her comfort. She did not want a bloody massacre. She wanted absolute, undeniable public justice. She wanted the blind fools who had laughed in the courtyard of her former home to see exactly what they had thrown into the freezing dirt. "No blood will be shed today," Saren said quietly, her pale lips curving into a small, stoic smile that did not reach her storm-glass eyes. "We will let the earth speak for itself. Stand with me." Silas rose to his full, towering height, his massive hand intertwining perfectly with hers. The fated, instinctual alignment of their wolves resonated through the garden. A deep, harmonious hum that made every single glowing frost blossom on the terrace flare with blinding silver light. The exiled servant was dead. The queen was ready to face the ghosts of her past. Completely anchored by a king who would burn the world just to keep her hands warm. The celestial amphitheater of the Moonlit court was a massive, open-air architectural marvel carved directly into the highest peak of the sovereign mountain. Tiered rows of pale grey marble descended in perfect, concentric circles toward a massive central dais forged from polished obsidian. The night sky above was completely clear, a vast, unbroken canopy of glittering stars that cast a harsh, unforgiving light on the political proceedings below. Hundreds of wolves from the allied northern territories filled the expansive viewing galleries. Their breath plumed in the freezing air, their posture rigid with nervous anticipation, and the heavy banners of their respective houses snapped violently in the wind. They had officially gathered for the Grand Northern Summit, but the dark, suffocating tension humming in the atmosphere suggested they were about to witness a public execution. Standing at the base of the obsidian dais, looking small and entirely isolated, was Jackson Silverbane. The alpha of the broken stronghold looked profoundly, physically diminished. The heavy, fur-lined mantle of his absolute authority hung loosely on his slumping shoulders, and the iron crown resting upon his dark hair seemed to weigh him down, drawing his posture into a defensive crouch. The metallic tang of ozone and dominance that once rolled off him in aggressive, suffocating waves was completely gone. In its place, he projected the sour, hollow scent of desperation, rotting wood, and ecological decay. For weeks, his territory had suffered under a brutal, unnatural winter that refused to break. The crops had died in the frozen dirt, the ancient boundary wards had fractured under the strain, and his pack was starving. The spiritual void left by violently severing his fated mate bond had manifested as a literal curse upon his lands. He was a king standing on a foundation of ash. Beside him stood Evelyn Voss. The deceptive mistress wore the ceremonial lunar silk, but the heavy, violet fabric no longer looked breathtaking. It looked like a tragic, oversized shroud threatening to swallow her whole. She was trembling violently in the biting cold, her sharp, beautiful features drawn and starkly pale with sheer terror. The cloying scent of her poisoned honey perfume could not mask the overwhelming biological stench of her guilt. She kept her eyes fixed firmly on the marble floor, completely terrified of the silent, heavily armed elite guard surrounding the upper perimeter of the amphitheater. At the absolute apex of the dais sat Silas. The warlord lounged in a massive throne of dark, unpolished stone, his midnight steel armor absorbing the ambient starlight. His storm-grey eyes were flat, entirely devoid of mercy or negotiation, as he stared down at the pathetic supplicants. Beside his throne sat a second identically carved seat of absolute power. It was currently empty, waiting for the woman who stood listening behind the heavy iron-bound wooden doors at the top of the amphitheater. Saren waited in the shadows, her breathing steady. The contrast to her arrival was absolute. 4 weeks ago, the spatial transition had been sudden and overwhelming. Crossing from the biting, howling winds of the outdoor mountain path directly through the massive iron castle gates into the immediate fire-warmed sanctuary of the indoor royal healing wing. Her recovery had been a slow, grueling rebirth. At the 2-week midpoint of her treatment, her body had seized violently as it purged the deep-rooted chemical venom. Silas had knelt beside her bed, his large, terrifying hands remarkably gentle as he coaxed her to drink the steaming marrow and winter root broth. "You do not have to face them until you are ready," he had rumbled, his thumb brushing a feverish bead of sweat from her pale brow. "Take your time, the world will wait." But the 4 weeks had passed, the poison was gone, and she was ready. "King Silas," Jackson began, his voice lacking its usual booming, arrogant resonance, echoing thinly across the silent, judging amphitheater. He held up the rolled parchment of the modified boundary treaty, his hands shaking slightly in the cold. "I come to formally invoke the terms of our blood-signed agreement. The Silver Keep requires immediate grain shipments and magical warding assistance. Our soil is frozen solid, our borders are failing, we traded away. The servant, exactly as you demanded. You are bound by this political pact to support your northern neighbor in times of ecological crisis." Silas did not lean forward. He did not raise his voice to command the space. "I am bound by my word to honor the true sovereign of the northern realms," he rumbled, the tectonic vibration of his tone chilling the blood of every wolf present. "But you are no sovereign, Silverbane. You are a desperate trespasser sitting on a stolen throne." Jackson's face flushed a dull, angry red, his fractured pride surging forward for one last pathetic defense. "I am the alpha of this territory by right of blood and fated bond. I cast out the defective Omega to secure my pack's future. My true Luna stands beside me. Your Luna, the Moonlit King stated with bone-chilling absolute finality, is a fraud." The heavy, iron-bound wooden doors at the top of the amphitheater groaned open. The entire assembly of northern lords turned in perfect unison, their collective breath catching audibly in their throats. Saren Frostmore stepped out into the starlight. She did not look like the humiliated woman who had been dragged before the altar. She did not look like the battered, bleeding servant who had knelt in the frozen mud. She moved with an unbent spine and a flawless, terrifying grace, dressed in her sweeping gown of spun silver and dark wool. Above her head, the crown of winter pulsed with blinding, undeniable, and absolute authority. 10,000 delicate frost butterflies swirled in a massive, luminescent halo, their crystalline wings emitting a soft, sacred chiming that instantly commanded the absolute silence of the vast amphitheater. The ambient temperature dropped dramatically, but it was the pristine, ancient cold of the winter gods, a cold that demanded immediate, instinctual submission from every wolf in attendance. As she descended the marble steps, moving toward the obsidian dais, the proud northern lords in the galleries did not just avert their eyes. They dropped to their knees, bowing their heads in profound, voluntary reverence to the true High Queen of the realm. The wave of submission cascaded down the tiered rows, leaving only the 2 traitors standing at the bottom. Jackson stared at her, his jaw completely slack, his panicked eyes wide with unadulterated horror, the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of the ancient magic, radiating from the woman he had violently discarded, shattered his entire worldview. He looked at the glowing frost butterflies, then at the confident, terrifyingly powerful stride of her inner wolf projecting through her vivid eyes. Saren. He breathed, his arrogant facade crumbling into utter, pathetic bewilderment. "How? Your mark was defective. You were completely barren." Orla Thorne stepped out from the deep shadows of the dais, holding a small, perfectly clear crystal diagnostic vial up to the starlight. The liquid inside was a violent, murky and sickly shade of green. Her mark was flawless, the wise healer projected, her voice ringing with absolute, unfiltered medical authority. Her wolf was chained. For 3 agonizing years, Your chosen mistress, Evelyn, systematically administered the insidious viper root poison into Saren's daily restorative teas. It is a highly controlled, outlawed venomous compound specifically designed to suppress the fated lineage, freeze the bone marrow, and perfectly mimic a defective bond. The mountain domain has been rotting into dust because you severed the true tether of the land to crown a treasonous snake. The revelation detonated across the silent amphitheater like a physical, blunt force shockwave. The quiet murmurs of the crowd instantly escalated into furious, deafening snarls of righteous outrage. Treason of the fated bond was the highest, most unforgivable sin in the mythological hierarchy of the wolves. Evelyn shrieked, dropping the heavy lunar silk as she scrambled backward, desperately trying to put physical distance between herself and the furious encroaching crowd. No, it was for the pack. She was weak. She wouldn't have known how to rule. She was nothing but a... Jackson turned on his mistress, his eyes wide with horrific realization as the puzzle pieces finally slammed together. The daily porcelain cups of tea, the cloying scent of poisoned honey permeating his chambers, the incredibly convenient timing of Saren's supposed biological failures. He had actively destroyed his own territory, fractured his own soul, and publicly humiliated the only woman who possessed the magic to save his lineage, all because he was too arrogant and blind to see the poison poured directly into his own cup. He whipped back around to face the obsidian dais. Saren had reached the platform, taking her rightful place standing right beside Silas. The Moonlit King did not force her forward, nor did he speak for her. He simply stood as an immovable, terrifying shield at her back, yielding the floor entirely to her sovereign judgment. Jackson's knees hit the marble. The heavy, hollow thud echoed his total, absolute defeat. The Alpha King, who had once demanded her collapse, was now weeping openly, tears of agonizing, belated regret freezing instantly on his pale cheeks. "Saren, please," Jackson begged, his voice cracking, entirely stripped of his pride and dignity. He crawled forward a single pace, holding out his trembling, empty hands in a pathetic display of supplication. "I didn't know. I swear to the ancestors, I didn't know she poisoned you. I was completely deceived. We can fix this. The fated bond, the tether, we can reforge it. You are my true mate. Please come back to our home. We need you. I need you." Saren looked down at him. She did not scream. She did not hurl venomous insults, and she certainly did not shed a single tear for the pathetic, broken man groveling in the dirt of his own making. She simply smiled. It was a cold, beautiful curving of her pale lips that contained absolutely zero mercy. The dramatic irony of the moment was perfectly complete. "The rejection ceremony was supposed to break me," Saren said, her voice quiet, steady, and carrying the devastating biological weight of an absolute truth. Everyone in that courtyard of the disgraced pack expected me to shatter. But I did not break, Jackson. You did. She lifted her right hand. The 10,000 frost butterflies of the crown of winter instantly reacted to her sovereign command. They surged outward in a massive, blinding cyclone of pure silver light. The luminescent swarm swept down over the amphitheater, rushing past the kneeling lords and completely engulfing Jackson and his cowering mistress. The magic did not cut or bleed them. It executed a purely spiritual, elemental retribution. The pristine silver ice instantly coated the Alpha King's heavy fur mantle, permanently freezing his stolen authority. The blood-signed parchment in Jackson's hand, the modified boundary treaty he believed guaranteed his survival, was enveloped by the frost butterflies. The document turned entirely to solid ice, becoming impossibly brittle before shattering into a million pieces of glittering dust that blew away in the violent winter wind. The heavy iron crown resting on Jackson's head suddenly cracked violently down the center, severed by the sheer weight of Saren's ancient magic rejecting his existence. It fell from his brow, clattering uselessly against the obsidian floor, the metallic ring echoing across the silent valley. The true magic of the earth had formally, publicly, and permanently stripped him of his rank. The amphitheater descended back into profound, awe-struck silence as the frost butterflies returned to Saren, swirling beautifully around her unbent spine. She turned away from the sobbing ruins of her past and looked at the moonlit king. The terrifying warlord reached out, his fierce gaze burning with absolute, unconditional devotion, and gently laced his warm fingers through hers. They stood together at the apex of the world, two lonely, powerful souls who had finally found their safe hearth. Just weeks ago, she had been a woman in grey, kneeling in the frozen dirt of her own displacement. Now she was the High Queen of the Starlight Court, unbinder of poisons, and recognized by the ancient gods themselves. She had stepped aside once, believing herself unworthy. She would never step aside again. The Ztutova Keep fell to ruin, but the celestial court of the mountain stood eternal. Thank you for listening to this story of quiet survival and sweet vindication. If you believe some betrayals are too late to forgive, please hit that like button. Leave a comment sharing if you would have walked away with a smile, and subscribe to join our pack for the next chapter of the wild.